Archaeologists uncover 3,000-year-old castle at bottom of Lake Van. A lake in Turkey has been the subject of legend for some time now. For decades, divers and researchers have flocked to the lake in search of an ancient city rumored to linger in the water's salty depths. Until very recently, those rumors have shaped up to be nothing more than folklore. When a group of divers took their modern equipment to find out for themselves, however, they were in for a huge surprise. If you've heard of the Lost City of Atlantis, you'll be blown away by the Kingdom of Urartu, which has been hidden in Lake Van for over 2,000 years. Watch on to find out more about the expedition and its remarkable findings. Thousands of years ago, a volcano erupted in the area. The lava spill ended up blocking Lake Van's outlet. The lake sits at an impressively high altitude. It's claimed that the lake can be found some 5,380 feet above sea level, which is approximately 1.6 kilometers. At such a high altitude, you'd expect that the water would freeze, especially given the fact that the lake is surrounded by snow. Surprisingly, the lake remains in liquid form because of the salt levels. In Turkey, the gorgeous Lake Van welcomes visitors from around Europe to admire its stunning turquoise water. The natural wonder is located next to an impressive mountain and is surrounded by lush greenery and rich nature. On the edge of the cliff, visitors can admire an ancient church which blends into its natural surroundings. The remarkable architecture complements the natural scenery, creating the perfect scene where the man's architectural talent combines with nature's pure beauty, resulting in something very special. The lake was formed over 600,000 years ago at a time when the Earth was a very different place. Since the lake was formed, the water levels have risen and the place looks very different than it must have looked thousands of years ago. It's possible that the rising water levels engulfed objects on dry land, including a mysterious artifact that was found at the bottom of the lake. Unfortunately, human history wasn't recorded until the 30th century BC, so we have no idea how the artifact got there. Lake Van's been attracting scientists for years because it is part of ancient history. They've studied the lake for decades, trying to discover more about its ontology and history. The scientists focused their efforts on the chemistry and geography of Lake Van. Despite the fact they've been investigating the lake for the best part of a century, none of them discovered the huge structure sitting in the depths of the waters. In fact, if it wasn't for a specific event, it may have still remained undiscovered to this day. Over 1,000 years ago, Lake Van was close to Tushpa, which was once the capital of Urartu. Maps were very different back in the 9th century, and as you can see here, the location of the lake appears different to where it is now. During the Iron Ages, the Urartu kingdom was thriving. Legend tells us that the kingdom was active between 860 and 560 BC, but there's never been physical evidence that the kingdom actually existed. At least that's what we thought. Everything changed in 2017. A group of archaeologists were accompanied by a team of photographers and historians who planned to investigate the lake. They'd heard stories about an ancient kingdom, and their instinct was to go exploring so that they could find out for themselves if there was any truth to these tall tales. And so the team set off to investigate. They hoped to find ancient artifacts, but they would soon settle for learning anything new about Lake Van. The team of archaeologists, historians, and photographers planned to spend weeks investigating the lake. After all, it had been around for hundreds of thousands of years, so they were sure to find something hidden in its waters. At least that's what they all thought. However, they weren't the first to go exploring in the water's murky depths. In the 50s and 60s, a group of researchers had a similar hunch and made exploring the lake their mission. They certainly left more to discover, but they did stumble across something pretty interesting. The explorers in the 1950s had heard stories of a structure built in the Middle Ages. They'd been told the structure had been built somewhere between 476 and 1450 AD, and they hoped to discover it. Back then, the scientists didn't have access to the technology scientists have now. They may have had the ambition, but they weren't well equipped for underwater exploration. Come 2017, though, our group of ambitious explorers had the ability to discover whatever it was lurking down below. The team of archaeologists, historians, and photographers grouped together and teamed up with the best divers they could find. They met at Yale University, which fortunately for them was funding an underwater excavation study related to Lake Van at the time. The team of explorers set off together with hopes of discovering something wonderful. Nonetheless, they kept their expectations in check, fully aware that divers had tried and failed before them. They were in for a surprise. For decades, explorers have been drawn to the lake in search of an ancient treasure or lost city. Divers have found some stones and old bottles washed up, but there's been no indication that a lost city was hiding beneath the surface. That is, until now. National Geographic were among the researchers who've been in search of a city like Atlantis, and were also among the researchers who were in disbelief when the rumors turned out to be true. There really was something spectacular lurking in Lake Van. The team grouped together and slipped into their diving gear. With their cameras at the ready, they plunged into the waters of Lake Van, hoping to find something of interest. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found, though. Beneath the waters of the lake stood an ancient building presumed to be some 3,000 years old. The whole team were overwhelmed by what they'd found, fully aware of the historical significance of their incredible discovery, and in disbelief that they'd been the ones to find it. The ancient structure turned out to be a huge castle. The salty water of the lake had kept it preserved for thousands of years, where it sat waiting for someone to discover it. The divers had persevered and searched long and hard with hopes of finding an artifact of some sort. They weren't expecting to find an actual castle. Tuss and Ceylon, the head of the diving team, had no intentions of hunting an ancient structure. Subsequently, the huge find took him completely by surprise. Ceylon was looking for something very particular. He'd heard that a mythical sea creature lurked in Lake Van, and this was what he'd hoped to find. He had no interest in discovering historical artifacts until he found the castle, of course. Ceylon said, "There was a rumor that there might be something under the water, but most archaeologists and museum officials told us we won't find anything." Could there really be a mysterious monster lurking near the underwater castle? They may have found no strange creature, but the castle was impressive enough in itself. It had been preserved perfectly in the lake, in the same condition you'd expect to find an ancient castle on dry land. The real mystery was how the castle had gotten to the bottom of the lake. The structure was 1 kilometer wide and the walls were 4 meters high. The fact that such a massive structure had disappeared into the lake without anybody noticing or documenting the event was a head-scratcher. The area surrounding the lake was once known as the Kingdom of Van, and it existed from the 9th to 6th century BCE. The best explanation the team came up with was that the rising water levels destroyed the kingdom and resulted in the underwater castle. Now that the castle had been discovered, there was at last evidence that the long-lost Urartu kingdom actually existed. The discovery could teach us more about the Iron Age and give us new and exciting access to our history. After lengthy discussions, the scientists concluded the Urartian people had built a castle when water levels were significantly lower. Building a castle next to a water source isn't a bad idea, and they couldn't have known that the levels would rise. They subsequently decided that there must be even more mysterious structures hiding at the bottom of the lake, and that further exploration would be required. But it is still a mystery why the existence of the castle wasn't recorded. Although the structure was in remarkable condition considering it had been submerged in water for thousands of years, it was still a ruin. Some walls had disintegrated and there were piles of loose rocks. Chunks of the castle were found along the shore of the lake while the rest of the structure stood strong. The scientists examined the quantifiable data, measuring the walls and assessing the depth of the lake. Of course, the more they discovered, the more questions they had about the mysterious underwater castle. To the untrained eye, all a ruin can tell us is that a really long time ago there stood a castle. To the experts, however, a ruin is an opportunity to learn about the people who built the castle and the people who lived there. The trick is to examine the details closely. Ceylon's team scoured the walls high and low for any clues, and eventually they found something, a drawing of a lion etched into the rock. Could this be a clue? The researchers discovered that the lion was the symbol to represent the Urartu people. This meant that the drawing could be interpreted as a convincing evidence that the castle was built and owned by the Urartians. However, one man named Jeffrey Summers had a rather different opinion. It looks more medieval than something from the Urartian kingdom, claimed a scholar. If Summers' instinct was right, it means the castle was still standing during the medieval period, well before the Urartians were around. With this agreement among the team, more research was needed. Sure enough, they discovered some of the stones used to build the castle were originally made in the medieval period. What they concluded was the Urartians had recycled the materials from older structures. Not everyone could agree on that, though. One archaeology professor from Marmara University had his own idea and claimed that the walls seemed medieval or late antique period rather than Urartu. Urartia never used any material between ashlar wallstones to connect each other. Another scholar named P. Hewlin had a different opinion. He published a report on Lake Van and wrote that a lofty wall of later than Urartian times runs under the lake. This meant that some considered the castle to be pre-Urartian, some considered it post-Urartian, and others considered it to be Urartian. How does one go about knowing who's right? Before we go on, let's hear a little more of what P. Hewlin had to say about the mysterious underwater structure. Hewlin knew if he wanted answers, he'd have to dig deep. He examined all the artifacts found around Lake Van and paid particular attention to those that mentioned anything about the Urartian king Rusa. This was easier said than done, considering that after hundreds of years, the natural elements had made the writings rather difficult to read. But instead of giving up, Hewlin decided to do everything he could to figure out what the inscriptions said and use them as clues to find out the truth about the castle's origins. After King Sarduri II died, King Rusa I became the king of Urartu. Rusa was a conqueror and expanded the kingdom during his father's reign, establishing dominance over several Anatolian territories. This was great for his father's kingdom, but not so great for the people whose lands he conquered. His conquests may have been successful, but as king he had many enemies. The owners of the lands he conquered sought revenge, and he'd soon have to suffer the consequences of his unjust actions. Once Rusa sat on the throne, the Assyrians were ready to plot their revenge. They appointed a new king themselves, King Tiglath-Pileser III. He was a strong leader and organized his people, training them for battle. He wasn't willing to let King Rusa get away with what he'd done and planned to reclaim all the land that had been taken from him and his people. Unlike the king that came before him, Tiglath-Pileser III would fight back and had no intention of failing. King Tiglath-Pileser III spent weeks preparing his armies to take back his lands. It's unknown what had exactly happened when the battle took place, but some researchers have an inkling the castle's disappearance was involved. They theorized that the battle caused the castle to become displaced and it was then submerged in the waters. Even though we can never know for sure what happened, we can examine the different theories and make a best guess based on the evidence that's been found. Rusa didn't sit on the throne for long before battle was initiated. King Tiglath-Pileser III gathered his troops who'd been trained for battle and prepared to take the land back. They weren't looking to negotiate, they were looking to forcefully reclaim what was rightfully theirs. If you're a fan of Game of Thrones, you'll be all too familiar with these kinds of battles. Moreover, territory was common at the time and whoever won gained power. Time and time again, the Urartu kingdom was invaded, and after each battle, the kingdom needed to be repaired. No matter how well they restored the castle, it would be knocked back down and slowly it began to deteriorate. They simply lacked the resources to hold off the constant attacks. Bit by bit, King Tiglath-Pileser III's army was bringing down the kingdom. They hoped that their efforts would pay off and eventually the kingdom would fall and they could reclaim their land. While under siege, the Urartu people suffered greatly. They were slowly running out of resources and were tired of being constantly attacked. Eventually, they had no choice but to admit defeat, and so they begrudgingly agreed to hand over their land and castles to the people of Assyria. By the end of the siege, King Rusa I had lost his kingdom and lost his mind in the process. He had given up on all the lands he'd conquered and felt like a failure to his people. As it stands, this is as far as the known history of Lake Van goes. The discovery has certainly attracted a fair share of scientists, archaeologists, and researchers as the mystery's so great. A lot of people are keen to be the ones who uncover the truth about the underwater castle. One day, researchers may crack the mystery of who built the castle and what happened to the Urartian people in their kingdom. For now, though, Lake Van and its ancient contents remain very much a mystery. Archaeologists working in the same area have also discovered jars that once contained wheat, oil, and wine in the ruins of a castle the Turks call Şavez Tepe, built by Osiris Arduri II, ruling from 764 to 735 BC. Each jar has a capacity of 300 kilograms, according to archaeology professor Efet Zvagulu. The jars were buried and the orifice was covered with a ceramic cover that had engraved units of wedge writing. There are few things that evoke as much curiosity, fear, and wonder in the human imagination as caves do. Maybe it's something about our dark evolutionary past, and maybe it's the result of our folklore and legends, but whatever the reason, caves seem to hold a certain allure and magical grip over us that's equal parts an intense desire to explore and a deep primordial fear. Enter any cave no matter how shallow and you'll feel this, but some caves, deep dark ones, hold secrets and mysteries that have baffled the scientific community and ignited the imagination of millions. From never-before-seen biological life forms to ancient corpses and burial grounds, some caves contain mystery that science has yet to explain.